Hello and welcome to the next episode of the Klingberg Wing Mark II development. I'm Raul Klingberg, your host. Today I'm going to be talking about development of the process to produce and the production of carbon fiber tubing for the leading edge of the winglets. This tubing is tapered because, of course, the winglets are tapered, and it is sized to fit the ribs without any additional forming required. So what you see here before you is a tapered mandrel that I've spiral wrapped in a vacuum bag material. It's the plastic that will keep the carbon fiber tube and epoxy from sticking to the mandrel. The mandrel, believe it or not, is the top end of a fishing pole. I went to my local Walmart and I searched through all of the various tops that they had, and they were kind enough to sell me just the top of the fishing pole that I needed. And then I removed the line guides and all the other accoutrement and smoothed it up, and it makes a wonderful mandrel for making tapered tubes. Of course, there was a bit of searching involved to find one that had the right diameters at the right length. The other item shown in the picture here is a roll of carbon fiber tubing or sleeve. This material is made by helically winding toes of carbon fiber fabric onto a former of some kind. I've never seen it actually done, and then they spool it up on a reel as it comes off the machine. So you literally have a tube of carbon fiber material where the toes run on the bias. So the resulting tube is quite strong in torsion. This tube is also very handy because as you stretch it out, it becomes smaller in diameter, push it together, it becomes larger in diameter, and I thought it would work well for forming tapered tubes. Prior to using this material, I had tried using regular biaxial cloth, some unidirectional cloth, made a couple of tries, and neither one worked, so I decided to try this material, and you'll see in the video that it works out quite well. So let's move on with the actual production of the parts. Here you see me getting the material ready to slide on. Of course, I'm going to work from the narrow end to the wide end. I'm actually going to put more material on the mandrel than is needed. It's the material, the carbon fiber will actually be longer, and once I wet it out, then I will trim it to length when I'm done. You might also note that I've put an aluminum tube. I've glued it in the end of the fiberglass fishing pole. This is so I have something sturdy to mount in a vise or hook on the table, so I can give a good tug on the part and get it off of the mandrel. This mandrel has been prepared with that vacuum bag material spiral wrapped. The spiral wrap is 100% overlap so that the epoxy doesn't leak through the gaps and get on the mandrel. And it's also been sprayed with a petroleum-based mold release. And I'm sliding the material on here. I'm not making it overly tight to the mandrel, and that's so I can make sure that I get the epoxy worked into the fabric thoroughly. If it is too tight to the mandrel, it's very difficult to wet out the fabric. You need a little gap between the fabric and the mandrel. So here I'm actually pulling it tight here to make sure I have enough length, and then I'm going to push it back a little bit. At the end, I've left plenty of extra, and I found out that that's necessary so that you can twist it and pull it up tight. I have quite a bit of taper here. It's from a 1/2 inch down to 1/4 inch, and there's a lot of extra fabric at the small end. It was very necessary to pull hard, twist it, and clamp it in order to hold it in place. This next segment shows me preparing to wet out the first layer of fabric with epoxy. I'm going to put the cup underneath the tube so that as I wet it out, the excess epoxy drips back in the cup. I'm using a small acid brush to do this job. And it's basically, I'm putting on quite a bit of excess epoxy, enough so that some drips off, and I'm rolling the tube as I work along. And when I come back to it, some of the epoxy will have soaked into the fabric a little bit further, and I might need to add a little bit additional resin to fully wet out the fabric. The fabric changes colors ever so slightly when you get it properly wetted out, so you can actually visually see when you have it wetted. And I'm also going to put excess epoxy on this layer because I'm going to be putting on a second layer, and I want to make sure that that second layer is fully wetted out in addition to the first layer, and the second layer will suck up some epoxy from the first layer, and then I'll finish it off with more epoxy on the outside. So I'm going to switch to a fast forward here so you can see the process of wetting out the fabric. At this point, I'm taking quite a length of masking tape, and I'm wrapping it around the small end of the fabric where it extends beyond the mandrel. This is to group that fabric together tightly. I found that's necessary in order to get the second layer on. If you don't wrap it up and tape it down, the second layer will grab on it and cause the first layer to buckle up and slide up the tube. So I'm giving it a few twists here, and the tape's in place, and then I'll be able to slide on the second layer relatively easy. Because the first layer is wetted out, it can be a little challenging to slide the second layer on. You have to get one hand at the wide end and hold it in place so that you cause the fabric to buckle up enough and expand in diameter so it'll actually slide onto the mandrel. Overall, the process does not take very long. It's really just a little bit of fiddly work, and I suspect that with some practice, it'll go much quicker. Of course, I only have to make 2 of these, so how much practice do you get? But I wouldn't change the process. I thought that this worked out just fine. I would certainly not put down 2 dry layers and then attempt to wet them out. There'd be very little way to see whether or not that first layer was actually properly wetted. And here we go. I'm getting pretty close to the end. As you get closer to the full extension, you'll see more buckling in the second layer as it hangs up on the wet cloth of the first layer, but it's really pretty quick. And you're watching this real time, so you see that it went fairly smooth. I'm sure there are people that'll be faster at this, and there might be people that are slower. But overall, a relatively straightforward process. So there we go. I got a little bit of extra at the large end. I'll cut it off so I have a little bit of extra at the narrow end, and then I'll proceed with wetting out this second layer. Now I'm pressing or working the epoxy into the cloth. I found the best way to do this is just grip the mandrel really tight, run my hands up and down, and squeeze the epoxy into the cloth. Some extra epoxy comes off on my hands. We clean it off. And here I'm trimming the excess end of the fabric at the large end. This is so that the aluminum tube that I have mounted in the mandrel is exposed so that I can use that to mount and get a good grip on the other end to pull the part off. Really didn't take, because it's a tapered mandrel, it really didn't take very much force to pop it loose. It was more important to have the ends loosened up a little bit before I slipped it off the mandrel. And once the ends are loose, a couple of taps and it just popped right off. So I'm just trimming off the cloth here before I prepare to wrap it with peel ply and heat shrink. To complete the process, once these ends are wrapped, I do overwrap with 1.8 ounce Dacron peel ply and then a spiral wrap of heat shrink plastic before it goes in the oven. The other thing that you'll see me do here in the video is I will get down to the other end of the tube, and the excess fabric at the small end, I'll actually twist it around several times and put a clamp on it. That turned out to be necessary in order to pull the fabric tight to the mandrel along its whole length. If I did not twist and clamp that end, it would work its way up to the wider end of the mandrel and not be the proper size and not be tight to the mandrel at the small end. So it's just a little bit of fiddly work, twisting, put some masking tape on it, then I got a little paper clamp and put it on the end, and that worked out quite well. And I just left that sticking out of the shrink wrap. The mandrel is actually 2-3 inches longer than it needs to be to make the part. So these ends that I'm wrapping up are going to get cut off anyway. In this next segment, you're going to see me wrapping the Dacron peel ply onto the tube. All of the tapered tubing work I've done has required that release material and bleeder layers and plastic shrink wrap, overwrap have to be done in a spiral fashion. I try to do them so that I have a 50% overlap on the material so that I have 2 layers of coverage along the entire mandrel. It is a little difficult to get started at the shallow or the small end, but once started, it rolled up pretty quick and takes a couple of strips of peel ply material. Now, I started out with strips that were 3.5 inches wide or so. I thought I'd do this in a really fast wrap. That did not work at all. I had to go back to about 2 inches wide in order to get the material to wrap on the part. One of the interesting aspects of using this Dacron as a wrap on any of the tubing that I make is that it is necessary that it be able to skew slightly on the fabric in order to stretch it and pull it tight to the part. I found that the Dacron cloth that comes already pre-sliced into narrower widths, you can get it 1 inch, 2 inch, 3 inches, does not work at all. I cannot recommend it. Don't buy it. Don't waste your money on it. When they make that pre-made Dacron cloth that's to a certain width, I believe that they use a hot melt knife to cut them, and they actually end up sealing off the edges, and then the fabric will no longer skew or go on the bias, and it's impossible to wrap it tight on any tubing type material. So it's necessary to just buy a large roll of the material and cut off your own strips to do this wrapping. And as you apply tension on it, you can feel and see where it's not wrapping tight. You see me backing up here to redo a couple spots. Once you get going along the tube and get into the larger end, the wrap becomes easier. So why don't we fast forward this part and we'll get up to where I'm putting the heat shrink on. Once the peel ply has been wrapped around the entire length of the part, I wrap in a heat shrink plastic. If you've watched my other videos, you know that this is a window covering material, but there's many different types of shrink wrap. They all work fine as long as they're relatively low temperature ones. Once again, it can be a bit hard to get started at the shallow end, and as you work up the tube, sometimes the angle of the spiral reduces and you just have to wrap it off, tape it, and get a new strip of shrink wrap and start putting that on there. And now that I say shrink wrap, I'll have to remind you, do not use stretch wrap. Stretch wrap is something entirely different, used for packaging. Will not work for this process. It'll melt on you when you pop it in the oven, and I do recommend that you build the light bulb oven to cure these parts because they come out much stronger that way. You might be tempted to use the stretch wrap and figure that that's tight enough on the mandrel, but you'll get better results if you cure the parts off in an oven, and the stretch wrap will melt in the oven, so you need to have this shrink wrap. So the rest of the shrink wrap went fairly quick there, and I'm going to finish up here, take it off to the oven, and then I'll be back to discuss the finished parts. Okay, here we are. I have the piece of tubing I made removed from the mandrel. Mandrel's still nice and clean, ready to use for another part. It was a little bit of fiddly work to get this end opened up, released from the tape so that it would slide off. But once this was loose and the securing tape at the other end removed, it popped right off the mandrel. Nice fit to it. There appear to be no buckles or anything. This is really nice fit on the mandrel, a good part. I have a really nice piece here, 2 layers thick. It has excellent compressive strength and really phenomenal torsional strength. Bending a little bit less so, but that's okay because we're going to have a series of ribs in here holding it. overall, I'm very happy with this part. Let me check it one more time on the weight. I checked a little earlier. I think it's, yeah, this part is 1 3/4 ounces, which is very good. I would like it to be a little bit lighter. I'd like to get down to around 1 1/4 or 1 ounce for that leading edge. If I were to use spruce for the leading edge, the spruce here, this square piece comes in at 3.6 ounces. So by the time this was shaped like the tubing, you'd have the triangular shape here on the backside to fit the ribs. Ribs would come in like this, and you got to round off the front, taper it down. It would be about the same weight, about 1 3/4 ounces, maybe 2, maybe 1.6. The problem is that until the D-tube structure of the winglet is closed, it would be very difficult to shape this spruce without actually damaging the structure of the winglet in the process. With the carbon fiber tube, I can glue it right to the front of the ribs, and it's ready to have the D-tube sheeting come in. D-tube sheeting is going to come in this way. It's 1/64 inch thick plywood. It'll come in, bond on here on the tangent, and then the little lip gets sanded off and blended in. Should work out quite well. I'm going to make one more of these that is 1 layer thick instead of 2, and then I'm going to fill it with the expanding urethane foam and see if it comes out any lighter. 1 layer thick would be fine here out at the tip, but here at the base or the root, 1 layer thick is probably going to be a little too soft in compression. So, but filling it with foam should not add too much weight, so I might actually be able to get this down to 1 1/4 ounces or so, 1.5 ounces maybe. So I can save a little bit of weight by going 1 layer thick and then filling it with foam. The plus on that is a little less expensive. 2 layers, it's $1.50 a foot for this material, and an extra layer, 4 feet, so about $6. Save $6 on carbon fiber, a little bit on epoxy, and put some into urethane foam. It'd be a little bit cheaper. Now, some other things that I discovered in the process of making this. The fabric that went into this is nominally 3/4 of an inch wide when it's flat, and it's designed to go around tubing that's 3/4 of an inch down to, say, 1/2 inch. I forced it down to about 1/4 inch down here at the small end. I bought 1 size of this braided carbon fiber sleeve because I need it for doing more torque tubes for the elevons, and I just thought I'd try it out for the leading edge of the winglets. And what I found is that as you get down to the narrow end and this fabric begins to pull together and become thicker, it has a tendency to shift to one side. And this tubing is decidedly thicker on one side than the other side. It's okay. That thicker side, I'll just make that the forward-facing edge for durability purposes. I think this 2 layers will be plenty durable for usage. When this cures up good and solid in about 7 days, this will be highly impact resistant. Very pleased with it overall. This is the 3rd try. Third time's the charm. First 2 methods didn't work, but this one was pretty good. Happy with it. The other thing that I discovered along the way is that using the vacuum bag material as the mold release was really, I believe, superior to the polyester that I've been using for years. The vacuum bag material, because it's a little bit stretchy, was easier to pull out of the tube, and it had less tendency to stick to the inside. So overall, I was quite pleased with using that material, and I'm going to move on to trying it out on straight tubing that I make. So tomorrow I'll make another one of these that's 1 layer thick. I'll fill it with some foam. We'll come back. We'll take a look at the weight, see what we have, and go from there. And the other thing I forgot to mention is one obviously could make the leading edge of the winglets out of hard balsa in the same size, and it would be a lot easier to shape. You could probably shape that without damaging the winglet in the process, but it would not be highly resistant to dents on the leading edge. And considering the winglets get handled constantly, every time you put the wing together, take it apart, a lot of chance for denting the leading edge. So overall, even though we don't need the strength of steel, which is what this part is, it will make an excellent leading edge for the winglets. Okay, so here I am with the 2 leading edges that I've made for the winglets. We have the layout here for constructing the winglets. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the leading edges and my conclusion in terms of the best way to build them. This one is 2 layers thick of the braided carbon fiber sleeve. It is extremely stiff in compression. It is a very strong part. This weighs 1 2/3 ounces. This leading edge is made of 1 layer of the braided carbon fiber sleeve. Costs about $6 less to make this one than this one, and not surprisingly, it weighs half the amount. This weighs 0.8 of an ounce. It is a little bit soft in compression at the large end. Here's a piece that I cut off where I can more safely show you the amount of flexibility in that part. And that's a little bit more than I want. Now, half of the leading edge will be supported by the ribs that come in from behind and take care of any compressive loads that might come in this way. Plus there'll be the leading edge sheeting on here. But I am concerned about the leading edge itself. Now, filling this with foam is not going to help too much in terms of impact resistance and stiffness there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take unidirectional carbon fiber. This is 1/2 inch wide, and I'm just going to secondary bond this on the outside of the part here, right where the lead edge will be. I'll go about halfway up the part because once I'm down to this diameter here, it is plenty stiff, and this will stiffen up just the exposed leading edge portion of the tube and take care of any issues regarding impact resistance or stiffness and compression. I expect this piece to add, 1/10 of an ounce, maybe 2/10 of an ounce. So we're talking about a final part that weighs 1 ounce as opposed to 1 2/3. So overall, saves some weight. If we can save a couple ounces here and there, that is always most welcome. And going back here to look at the other alternate other than the spruce leading edge, the balsa leading edge. I could put balsa in here for the leading edge. In fact, the ribs are currently cut to accept this shape of balsa, and I would have to do a little splice here, and that's okay. By the time I shaped this part, it would weigh about the same as the single layer carbon fiber leading edge. This requires no additional shaping. It's molded to the final shape. This would require shaping before the leading edge sheeting is put on. I'd have to be working with the framework for the winglet without full rigidity, and I would risk damaging that structure before I finish shaping the leading edge. So having it pre-shaped is preferable. I'm going to go ahead and use the 2-layer one. I already have it. It's here. Having one side 0.6 of an ounce heavier than the other side, no big deal. So just go ahead and use the part. We save a little money and make the aircraft lighter by going to the single layer, which I recommend. Foam filling of the tube not required. So overall, an excellent answer. That braided sleeve tapered down nicely on the mandrel. The hardest part of the whole process was finding a fishing rod that had the appropriate diameters over the appropriate length. But there's hundreds of them out there, and sooner or later you'll find one that has the appropriate shape and use that as your tooling for making the leading edges. So we'll be back later to show some of the construction of the winglet as we go along. We're going to work on some bushings for the pivot tube that the winglet moves on, and then start the assembly of the actual winglet itself. So hang in there with me, keep watching. I appreciate your support, and please invite your friends to support and learn more about the construction of this, what I think is the most intriguing aircraft.